Joining us today on our lunch break panel on The Will Cain Show, we have with us Hannah Cox. She's president and co-founder of BASEDPolitics, and Julian Epstein. He's a former House Judiciary counsel. Thank you both for being here with us today on The Will Cain Show.
Good to be with you, Will.
Thanks for having us.
I'm glad to continue that conversation. You know what? I do want to start with somewhat of a provocative conversation. I want to talk about these protests that are taking place on college campuses that are framed as anti-Israel, in many cases undeniably anti-Semitic. Julian, I'll start with you. I kind of just want to entertain the question of why this is happening. You know, a lot of focus on Columbia, on Harvard, on Yale, a lot of focus on Ivy Leagues. But this is not limited to the Northeast. It's not limited to the coast. It's not limited to Berkeley and Yale. This is happening, I know, today at the University of Texas. This is happening all across America. And that leads to the question, why?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's a complex question. I appreciate very much at the outset you're saying your point about learning how to think rather than what to think, and sort of all of our institutions, from our mainstream media institutions and universities, I think, are telling people what to think rather than how to think. And I think that's part of the problem that's happening at the universities. Let me just say to your point, to your question that you set up. Is there legitimate criticism potentially? You can have an honest disagreement about whether there should be fewer civilian casualties in Gaza. You can have an honest conversation about that. What's going on in the universities is not what is occurring. What is going on in the universities is naked anti-Semitism, and there are just cases. If you looked at what happened at Yale over the weekend with Jewish students being taunted, being assaulted. The kind of language that is being used from river to the sea, all of these are naked statements that we should kill the Jews. The Jews do not have a right to exist in their ancestral homeland. The movement here that is on the college campuses is being led in many instances by SJP, Students Justice for Palestine. There are serious questions that are being raised now about what foreign money is coming in to influence this group. And I think there's a lot of evidence that some of our enemies, some of our adversaries are funding these groups. And I hope that the Republicans in Congress, I'm a Democrat, I used to be chief counsel of the Judiciary Committee, I hope the Judiciary Committee will do a serious investigation as to where this money is coming from, or one of the committees in Congress. So there are a lot of what I would call extremist surrogates who are orchestrating what's going on. So that's the first point. I think the second point is that there is a romanticization by some of the students that they are fighting or supporting a liberation movement. And this is very disappointing to hear that students, particularly at elite schools, could sort of fall for this narrative, which is just demonstrably false. But I think a lot of the reason that students are so susceptible is because universities, particularly elite universities, I got into law school at Columbia. I'm glad I didn't go there now. They are becoming camps of indoctrination and camps of sort of left-wing ideology rather than critical thinking, to your point. And I think a lot of students, you could get into a deeper cultural conversation about the breakdown of institutions, the breakdown of family, the breakdown of religion, students looking for some kind of purpose. So they find something like this, and they glom onto it as sort of this romanticized movement. But you have to keep in mind, the Palestinians have been offered a two-state solution 5 occasions. They have rejected it every single time. The leadership of the Palestinians preaches genocide. They preach the killing of Jews first, and then the decimation or the deconstruction of the West second. This is not a liberation movement. This is an extremist terrorist movement that uses Palestinians as their front. And the fact that, when you ask these students if they know anything about the history of this, for example, the West Bank and Gaza were both controlled by the Arabs until 1967. There was no protest about that. There's no protest about the 2 million Muslims that are killed in Sudan. no protest about what Assad did in Syria with killing 600,000 Arabs. You can go down the list. It's only when Jews want to defend themselves against the genocidal threat are they told that they cannot defend themselves and win the war. So this is a completely anti-Semitic movement. This is basically the Klan in Ivy League clothing.
Well, so let me go through a couple of things, Hannah, that I want to bring in. Here's in part the reason I ask what would sound like a provocative question of, is there any legitimate point inside the protest after you acknowledge all of the obvious anti-Semitism and ignorance? So you heard me talking about our conversation with David Sachs yesterday here on the Will Cain Show. He also recently talked about the protests on college campuses. And one of the points that he made is that we won't fully know about these protests until we have the fullness of time. His answer to that, his reason for that is, he said, you look back at the Vietnam protests of the 1960s, and while yes, there's a lot of ignorance and caricatures of hippies, you could look back on it with time and say, but was there any point to their protest of the war in Vietnam? Now, Julian, I think, laid out something. So if I were laying it out in layers, I would probably do it just like Julian did. I would say, one, this is in part astroturfed, in significant part astroturfed. This is SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, that is funded and organized. This isn't organic. Two, and this is important to me, is the point of ignorance, how little is actually known. And I think the answer to why so little is known is actually something you said as well, Julian. I think it's part of critical theory that has been part of education for half a century. And you could fire as many Columbia presidents as you'd like, but you're not going to solve the problem. You're going to have this crop up at the University of Texas or the University of Arizona. As long as education is centered on activism and oppressor and oppressed ideology instead of, as we talked about, critical thinking. Right. But then we get to the ignorance of, is there a legitimate point? So what you hear, Hannah, is students talking about genocide. Well, I would expand the ignorance to the present tense as well. And I'm going to share these numbers, and they're the best that I can do right now. The Gaza Health Ministry, which everyone dismisses the Gaza Health Ministry, but for the sake of this conversation, we won't, okay? They put the number of dead at 34,000, I think, currently. I think both Gaza and the IDF put the number of combatant deaths at roughly 18,000. That would put a civilian to combatant death ratio at something like 2-to-1, maybe 3-to-1, okay? Nobody celebrates civilian death. Civilian death is horrible, but civilian death is also part of war. It just is. If it's 2-to-1 to 3-to-1, this is like a historic war. Like, we didn't accomplish that in Fallujah. We didn't accomplish that in Afghanistan. It was way over that in World War II. The point is, in war terms, this is far from a genocide. This is a concerted effort to reduce civilian deaths. And that leads me to the ignorance of the protest. But I still don't want to dismiss. Is there a legitimate point somewhere inside these protests, Hannah?
Well, it's hard to say because who are the protesters? Who are the infiltrators? Who's being funded? What are their demands? Like, it is so murky, as you pointed out. And I think that really matters because when you look back on history, the Vietnam protests, I think, were vitally important. I think they were an actual uprising by the American people, by many of our veterans who had served in that war, who were coming back and reporting what we were doing over there, the failures of that policy, and how it was creating secondary problems, and ultimately, I think, led to the end of that conflict. I don't know that that's what's happening here. I think it would be really interesting to see the funding of these groups, particularly SJP. I come from grassroots organizing. I come from the groundwork. Things don't pop up like this organically. That's not how these kinds of movements tend to move. So there is something kind of fishy about this to me, how it is so well organized and orchestrated and how it has come about so quickly. To me, that does say there's probably a lot of money at play and larger entities that are coming in and whipping people up. And then you also have agitators. I think if I were a protester, and to be honest, I think yes, to answer your question, I think there are some real problems with what Israel's doing. I personally, as an American, do not want to be funding this. That is a valid conversation to have. It's also a valid conversation to say that if we are going to fund these kind of conflicts, we're going to get more involved, then our Congress needs to actually be voting on entering wars, which they don't do anymore. So these are really valid criticisms that could be brought up. I can't hear those because of all the anti-Semitism. So if I was somebody protesting, the first thing I would do would be to stringently disavow these infiltrators who are anti-Semitic, who are hateful, and to shout them down, to separate them from your movement, because now your whole message has been co-opted and nobody can hear anything else but the absolute hatred coming out of these campuses.
Can I respond to a couple of those things?
And I would add to this, I'll go back to you, Julian. Yeah, let me just add to it really quick, Julian. I would add maybe there's legitimate debate and protest to be had about the long-term future of this problem, right? Like, can you actually stamp out Hamas? Is it an accomplishable goal? Or, like, even if you do, then what is the long-term future of the Palestinians in Israel? But I agree with Hannah. That's not what I hear. That's not what I hear taking place at Columbia. That's not what I hear taking place, at Yale. So could there be a legitimate point? Yes. Is there a legitimate point? It's not audible.
So I think Hannah makes a really good point there, Will, about if there is criticism, you can't hear it for all the anti-Semitism. I think that's a really, really good point. Let me return to your notion about the civilian-militant ratio. If the number of militants is 18,000 and the overall number of deaths is 34,000, then that's a 1-to-1 ratio, not a 2 or 3 to 1. That's about 1-to-1.
Right.
Normally, right. in urban warfare, the civilian militant ratio is anywhere between 4-to-1 and 9-to-1. So if you go back to Mosul or Fallujah, or what we did in Afghanistan, what we did in Iraq, go back to Japan, sort of any of these instances, the civilian ratios are much higher. So no army in the history of urban warfare, and I challenge anyone to, I defy anyone to challenge me on this, has done more to protect civilians than Israel has done. Now, the criticism, to Hannah's point, that some make is, well, it should be more surgical. Going after Hamas in Rafah should be more surgical. Nearly every expert on urban warfare says you can achieve certain goals with a surgical pinprick approach. You cannot take out the Hamas battalions without moving in a ground army into Rafah. There's no way to do it. You just can't do it because you have to destroy the infrastructure. So you can have that debate. I don't think the criticism on Israel is really well-founded. I think most military experts would think it's not well-founded. The second point I would make is, if the conduct that you see going on in Columbia and elsewhere in the universities, imagine for a minute these attacks were directed at Black Americans. Imagine that Black Americans were being beat up, they were being bullied, they were being told in instances to go back to Africa. Imagine this was happening on a massive scale. What do you think the reaction of the left would be? The reaction of the left would be they would lose their minds, which shows you, I think, the bankruptcy of a lot of this civil rights ideology that's occurring. And I speak as a Democrat here, right? I think it shows it unmasks the bankrupt ideology of the sort of oppressor-oppressed, we're for civil rights, we're going to help people who are vulnerable. I think it shows it's completely opportunistic and it's driven towards elections. And maintaining electoral majority. The third point that I think is just important to make here, you can criticize Israel. I don't think it's very solid. I think you have to have, and this is responding a little bit to where I disagree with Hannah, I think you have to have a little bit of moral clarity here. What's going on in the Mideast right now is a colonial attempt by Iran to create hegemony throughout the Middle East with an ideology that will kill women for wearing hijabs, persecute and throw gays off of buildings for being gay, that will persecute every religious minority and ultimately believes in destroying the West. And they use through Hamas the Palestinian issue as a way of provoking this wider war. And this is an ideology that is no different from Nazi Germany. Hamas in its charter talks about killing the Jews, right? It's in their charter. They openly admit it. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank basically applauded what happened on October 7th. What had happened on October 7th was the intentional massacring and dismembering of women and children and every civilian they could get their hands on. There's no difference between what Nazi Germany did and what Hamas believes in and what Iran is trying to promote through Hamas. And this is the leadership that the Palestinians have chosen in Gaza, and a less extreme, but also really extreme leadership that they have chosen on the West Bank. And if there were people that were confused in World War II about whether we should go after the Nazis in Germany and whether it was really in America's interest. If we had listened to them then, we'd all be speaking German today. So I think while it's in the spirit of what Hannah said, I think it's important to have conversation and debate. I think only a fool would not see the moral clarity that is called for here.
I want to move on to something else in just a moment, but I want to give you a chance to respond, Hannah.
Yeah, I think you can have moral clarity, but there are many bad guys out there. There are many terrorist organizations. There's many evil governments. We don't have to wait for them to come destroy us. We're going to destroy ourselves, shipping all of our tax dollars overseas and continuing to let our country decline. Our people can't afford basic groceries. We have a border that we can't secure. So, I mean, you can have moral clarity, but that doesn't mean you always get involved in every conflict. And I think we can see the foolishness of that agenda played out under the George Bush years and the war on terror, where we spent billions of dollars, lost tons of American lives, and basically did all of that just to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. If these regions are going to rise up, they have to be able to defend themselves. The people in those countries have to be willing to stand up for their own countries. Israel has plenty of funding. I don't think this is our war. I don't think we should be involved. And there is the real presence of blowback and secondary causes that occur for this kind of action. So you have to, look at the big picture, look at all the secondary effects that could come about. I'm not convinced this is something we should be involved in. And if it is something we're going to be involved in, then once again, Congress should have to take hard votes and answer to the American people about those votes if we're going to get involved in wars. That's a basic constitutional principle that has gone out the window since World War II, and it's inexcusable.
I
wanted to see if Julian wanted to jump back in on this Democrat versus libertarian debate.
I think that you can have a good debate about the Iraq War, and Bush made a mistake there. I don't see the honest intellectual disagreement about whether we should be funding Israel here. I mean, this is a fascist ideology that is bent on destroying the West. The amount of funds that we are giving to Israel is a thimbleful to basically protect not only our most important strategic ally, but the whole idea of Western democracy and Western civilization that Iran and Hamas are trying to destroy. And if it falls there, the repercussions of what happens with Iran hegemony in the Mideast, I mean, $14 billion is a footnote in that kind of world. I don't understand any honest intellectual debate that disagrees with our need to be involved and to defend Israel. I just don't. From a moral point of view and from a strategic point of view, I just don't see it. And Israel does not have enough capacity on its own to defend itself. Just witness what happened when Iran attacked Israel with 300 missiles. But for the help of the Jordanians, the U.S., the French, the British, some of those missiles would have gotten through the Iron Dome. So I think the notion that it is a country of approximately 10 million people, 7 million people in a sea of several hundred Arab countries, many of whom are vowing its destruction. I mean, the notion that you're going to sort of say we shouldn't help because of $14 billion, which is a lot of money, but it is a footnote in the larger context, just seems to me to be I don't know that argument.
Avoiding the deeper question of the necessity of involvement. I do disagree with two things that you said there, Julian. I mean, I think Israel, is extremely capable of defending itself on its own. I think history backs me up on that. Every aggression from any type of player, nation state or terrorist state, has been thwarted by Israel. Second, while there might have been French and American and British planes in the air to shoot down those 300 rockets a few weeks ago, it was only because it was part of a choreographed dance. I mean, those rockets were going to come down. That was telegraphed. I mean, that was not some surprise attack. I mean, Israel could have handled it on its own. Maybe it required some intelligence back channels from other nations involved, but that didn't show in any way to me Israel's reliance on the greater world stage to handle that weak and choreographed and telegraphed attack from Iran.
Yeah, but Will, the Iron Dome is something that was built with not just the financial, but the technological cooperation of the United States and the West. And every war that Israel has fought after the 48 war, 67, 73, the Intifadas, all of the other skirmishes that occurred, 82, were all done with were all supported by the United States and the West militarily, strategically, financially, and with technology. So I take your point on the telegraphed attack by Iran, but the notion that Israel should be left on its own to fend for itself in this kind of sea of hostility. Again, you're talking about 7 million people in an Arab world of 200-300 million, many of whom are avowed enemies of Israel. I don't really take that argument very seriously.
All right. I want to move on to a couple other things while I have you both here. I'm hoping that Hannah isn't on a tight timeline. I think I was told ahead of time she might have to be out at a certain time. But we'll start with this. Let's just lighten the mood for just a moment. Democrat, Libertarian, let's sort out this debate on texting etiquette. This is what a problem I had with my Fox and Friends co-host Rachel Campos Duffy. Watch.
If you, and not you,
now he's going to give us advice.
If people at large, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about people at large. If you meme people, you give them an opening to stop responding.
I don't expect a response to.
I know, but that's what I'm saying. Like, once you meme them.
Screenshots.
Well, you know who she then texts with those memes? Me.
Yeah.
And then I respond.
Yeah, you're really good about that. You always give a ha 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 or a heart on the meme. You're
just
really
an acknowledgement. That's it.
That's
it
all
was
I
received.
need.
So I'm a notoriously bad texter, meaning I don't respond. It's incredibly rude. I'm not proud of it. But I do think if you send me like a meme, a joke, a picture, I don't think I'm compelled to respond, especially if it's on a group chat. Like group texts, I'm a horrific participant. I do not respond to group texts. I think I'm admittedly bad, but I don't think I'm guilty of a crime in this situation, Hannah. I think that I don't have to lay a heart or a ha 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 on your joke.
I wish I could be as free as you are in this, because my fiance is a nefarious reel sender. I mean, he sends me like 20 reels a day, and it really upsets him if I don't watch them. So I feel like I am in real jail. Like I have to watch and respond to each and every single one, and I don't know how to get out of it.
Julian, a group text requires... I think Larry David actually did this on Curb Your Enthusiasm. I think he did, like, group texts, ha-ha-ha's. These are not necessary.
No, they're not. And, there aren't any rules, and some etiquette expert should set rules on it. Look, I get dozens of them a day. And, one of the great things we've learned from Jonathan Haidt's book on the anxious generation is we are so distracted so constantly by all the things coming in that we can never do long-form thought. Like this conversation that you and I and Hannah are having about Israel is a very good conversation, a very productive conversation where we're actually thinking critically, to use your setup. With all of this stuff coming in nonstop, I mean, you just look at not just that, but our social media distractions. What's happening is our attention spans are getting shorter. Our need for that quick dopamine hit is getting quicker. It's changing the culture in many ways. You should try to get Jonathan Haidt on this podcast. He's really terrific on how
I'd love to.
Rewiring our minds. So I think this is part of a larger thing of the culture of distraction that is doing a lot of bad things. I think I don't think you have to respond. I respond to every text that's sent to me on a one-on-one text, but on groups, I think you're okay. I'll give you a pass on that.
See, that's the problem. I can't run that virtue up the flagpole that I respond to every text that comes in either. So it's like guilty of one crime, guilty of them all. All right, finally, Hannah, I found this pretty significant. And I don't want to find it significant because it came from Bill Maher. Although Christopher Hitchens once said, if an atheist wakes up every day and said God is not real, nobody listens. But if the Pope woke up one day and goes, I'm not so sure about this God thing, everybody'd be like, what? So it is of natural relevance that it came from Bill Maher. But I think the point, even if it didn't come from Bill Maher, is fascinating. Watch this from Real Time.
So I don't know if this documentary is the talk of your town, but it is out here because it didn't just expose a dangerous workplace. It also exposed hypocrisy, because it must be pointed out that when the evil governor of Florida was saying the exact same thing about kids and creepy stuff at Disney that liberals now find intolerable at Nickelodeon, He was dismissed as a hick and a bigot. But why would a kids' content factory like Disney be all that different than the one at Nickelodeon? A 2014 CNN report discovered that at least 35 Disney employees had been arrested for sex crimes against children, and in 2021, Disney child star Allison Stoner confessed she only narrowly survived the toddler-to-train wreck pipeline. You know, Willie Sutton said he robbed banks because that's where the money is, and the reason we find pedophiles in the Boy Scouts and the Rectory and kids' TV is that's where the kids are. DeSantis wasn't wrong, but we're so tribal now, the left will overlook child if the guy from the wrong party calls it out.
It's so fascinating, especially that last line, Hannah. Like, first of all, for Maher to say DeSantis wasn't wrong is worthy of its own note. But more importantly, if the wrong guy points out something, it's not only unheard, it's dismissed as conspiracy, Hannah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've already seen this kind of hypocrisy, I think, play out on the national stage. When you had the whole Me Too movement going down, you realized all the people on the left that had been covering for Harvey Weinstein and then Jeffrey Epstein, and it really did expose how, I think, shallow their professions of supporting women really are. I'm not surprised to see this. Anybody who's ever had to be in charge of children knows this is a real threat. My dad's a pastor. They have to spend significant resources at churches ensuring that you don't have predators coming in trying to work in children's departments, get access to them. Of course, you're going to have weirdos who try to attach themselves to these kinds of companies and get access to kids. People need to be on guard against this. It should not be politicized. It should be an open, obvious, general concept people can come together on to protect kids and look out for them. I don't really understand how these things ultimately got so politicized, but it is nice and refreshing to hear him acknowledge this, and hopefully more people will wake up to it, because it's really sad what's coming out, and I think we're going to find out even more with some of this P. Diddy stuff that's breaking over the next couple of months. I really think that you have a lot of Hollywood that has been harming kids, particularly at these channels like Nickelodeon. We're really learning a lot about the producers on some of those shows that were harming kids. So it's a national conversation that needs to happen, and we need to just set the politics aside and figure out what are the best protocols to ensure that these people don't have access to children.
I got to see this thing on about Nickelodeon, Julian.
Oh, it's unbelievable, the Nickelodeon piece. I mean, if this doesn't shock everyone with any common sense and good sense, I don't know what would. But look, I think Hannah makes some good points there. Let me say, for the last couple of years, I've lived most of the year in Florida. And I live in a building in Miami that is mostly Democrats. And when the whole Don't Say Gay controversy occurred with DeSantis, almost every single Democrat who most of them were parents, all of them said, this is not just Bill Maher, all of them said, you know what, I think Ron DeSantis is right. And I don't know why this sort of cottage industry of school administrators across the country think it's their place to start teaching gender ideology to young kids. It's sort of sexualizing young children in a completely inappropriate way. And when you begin to see what's happening in the Democratic Party with black and brown working class voters moving over to the Republican side, the sort of critical gender ideology, critical race ideology with DEI, sort of all of these things are things that most people just find lack complete common sense and are a sort of an ideology of a certain group of elites that is attempting to impose it on the rest of the country, and in a way that just sort of lacks common sense. You know, there's a very important report that just came out of the UK, the Cass report, which you should examine on your show one day, which was looking at the gender transition issue. And what the report found was that the science on this is almost non-existent, and that a lot of these kids with sort of gender confusion, gender dysphoria, have lots of problems, lots of emotional problems. And what is happening with this cottage industry of financially conflicted sort of gender transition, the gender transition industry, is that they are forcing upon, or not, maybe not forcing upon, but, you know, pushing young kids towards gender transition in a way that is abusive. It is making their problems worse. It's making suicidal issues worse. It's making depression issues worse. But this is being pushed by this industry of, you know, this is a financially conflicted industry that is pushing these issues on kids. And what the Cass report is showing is that this might be having really, really serious adverse consequences on the kids to the point where it's becoming child abuse. But that doesn't stop people on the far left from proceeding with these kinds of things.
And to be honest with you, I don't think that's because of financial interest. I think it's an ideology that's lost itself in the insanity of where we started this conversation, that critical theory of, gender politics or bigger identity politics. I saw some of that, what you're talking about, which is like the percentage of kids going into this stuff that have are on the spectrum of Asperger's and autism, or have a parent who is like, I think they call it like a class B parent, but it's a little bit like Munchausen syndrome type of parent who's using their child to virtue signal in some way, or those that have been abused. Like the percentage of kids that go down this road before the abuse have already suffered from some kind of affliction or abuse and are using this as an outlet.
But let me say, the case of the institute in UK that closed. There was a major institute that did the transgender procedures on youth and teens that closed. I'm no expert in this area, but there is a lot of criticism that there was a big financial incentive of this UK institution that was pushing gender transition to keep pushing this on as the first option. So when a kid comes in who's got Asperger's, gender dysphoria, all of this kind of stuff, they push it on them as the first option. There is a financial element here that was a big part of the criticism when this institute closed. So I don't think it's something I don't brush over that point.
No, and I don't mean to either. It's certainly an element. I think that we have a societal insanity that supersedes. It's a bigger umbrella over the pockets of financial interest, which do exist, driving this entire thing. I got to leave it here. Hannah Cox, Based Politics on X, Hannah D. Cox, and Julian Epstein, former House Judiciary Counsel, also on X at Julian Epstein. Thank you both for being on the Will Cain Show today.
Thanks so much, Will.
Thanks for having us.